having thrown off Spanish Catholicism, the Spanish American leaders were immediately confronted with a new empire, the United States, which revitalizes the doctrine of conquest as it moves west to justify its moving west. And so Spanish American independence leaders and their successors and the intelligentsia and intellectual class, they had a whole ready-made intellectual critique of conquest that had previously been applied to Spain that they now directed at the United States. And that's why the Latin American critique of the United States is so profound and so enduring. It's intellectually rooted in this rich history of ideas, and it's socially rooted in the history of colonialism and of course dealing with the United States as it's taking Florida, as it's taking Mexico, as it's then taking Cuba and Puerto Rico.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I know that this is not the major focus, but you did mention racism. And I've always found this fascinating. The cast paintings that they did, which your book also mentions, where they have this very like pseudoscientific breeding chart almost, right? So it's like on the top left, it's a Spaniard with a Jew makes a with an Indian. Freudian slip. I read Jew. It does look like Judía, but India says. Then mestizo with a Spaniard makes castizo. Then castizo with a Spanish woman makes Spaniard man. I mean, they go through all of these things. So there was a lot going on in terms of, I guess, like race science.
Yes, without doubt. And this classification is certainly the foundation of ongoing racial hierarchies. Right. But it's also an example of the tension between a state that acknowledged that it is universal, that it is absolute and universal, and yet organized. This is exactly what I meant by it administers difference. Right. It recognizes difference. It has all of these categories, and they go on and on and on, and they never end. And, and they keep going. I mean, I have a list in the book, and, they go on, and some of them are kind of funny because
turn back around.
Yeah, like, here's like 15 of them, right? Like originally it was supposed to be an Aristotelian symmetry between Indios and Spaniards.
Oh, okay. That's also something you would never see in like an English version of this, right?
Well, there was a Republic of Indians and a Republic of Spanish. Right. Well, it turns out, like when they start having sex with each other, that breaks down pretty quickly. Right. Like there's like a Spanish and Indian beget mestizo and Spanish woman beget castizo. It goes on and on. Lobo, I don't even know what Lobo is. An Indian woman beget Zambiago. I don't know. And the scribe had a sense of humor. Number 7 on the list was Torno Atrás, which was the product of a 2-white child of a Spanish man and an albino woman. And a turno atrás means a step backwards. Number 15 was the offspring of a coyote mestizo and a mulatto, which the scribe called ahí te estás, which in Spanish means, and there you have it. Yeah. But there you didn't have it because it kept going on.
Right. And here's no te entiendo.
Yeah, no, another one was no te entiendo.
I don't understand you. Yeah.
So there was a sense that by the time you get to the 1820s, it's, this attempt to reconcile universalism with difference just collapses under its own weight. You can't keep going on with these subdivisions. On the other hand, though, it is an example of this, there wasn't one Spanish independence leader that didn't want to cast all of this aside and just declare everybody a citizen. But they also knew that they couldn't because they were products of a colonial system, and they recognized, that they needed an activist state, and it would take time to create citizens. And it's out of that kind of awareness that comes, and we could talk about it later on, how Latin America, it really is gestates what becomes social rights, in political theory. We can talk about that later on if you want.
Yeah, well, definitely. And I wanted to shift a little bit. And I want to ask you, speaking of Catholicism, one of the things that your book really exposes or gets into is the way that, the Catholic Church can act as a force of unthinkable evil and bloodshed, and then also as kind of a bulwark against slavery and genocide and displacement through the teachings and writings of figures like Las Casas or, Montesinos. And then, of course, we know people like Oscar Romero, and who was killed himself, who was a liberation theologian. But where does Pope Francis, the recently departed Pope Francis, fit into this trajectory? Because from what I've read from you and from others, it's not quite as neat a categorization.
He was an Italian child of Italian immigrants. He was born in Argentina, and he came of age under Peronism, when the working class and the poor were entering the political arena and demanding social rights, when the state was building the social state. He had a sense of that. He became a priest in 1969, just as a lot of the kind of political effervescence was about to be destroyed by death squads and the anti-communist military regimes. The Chilean coup is in 1973. The Argentine coup is in 1976, and he's the head of the Jesuit order. And it's a little murky. There's a long essay. It's not an obituary. Colm Tobin, that Irish writer. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah. I think so, yeah.
It was in London Review of Books, or maybe it was in the New Left Review. I'm not sure, but it gives a really good overview of this period. And there's questions about whether he did enough to protect Jesuits, and two Jesuits in particular. And there's a way to read his papacy as almost like an atonement for his failings. It affected him, and he wasn't a radical. He wasn't a liberation theologist. He was actually quite theologically conservative. The question is, and there's even some rumors, the CIA intervened at least one other time in a conclave when it nudged the appointment of Pope Paul in the 1960s, because they thought he would be conservative. They thought there's a story. I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Yeah.
There was a sense that he would actually be useful in clamping down on the Latin American left, which at that time, when he became Pope, was very strong. Chavez, Lula, Kirchner, Morales, they were all there. And in the same way that Oscar Romero was a conservative, he was picked because they thought he would uphold the status quo. So there's ways in which social reality in Latin America radicalizes you. And he represents a certain kind of Latin American sociality. So I don't know what accounts for him making such a deliberate stand for the progressive wing of the Catholic Church in the middle of the schism, because it is a schism. The Christian right is insane, and it's part of this whole global fascist movement, and they think that Pope Francis was a pretender, and they think the Vatican is illegitimate, and they want it back. And and I don't know if they're going to get it back. We'll see. But he did take a stand, and he said some dicey, cringy things, and he fumbled about child abuse, particularly in Chile. Although he did have a complete turnaround in Chile, and he recognized exactly the depth of the problem, and he said he was wrong, and he basically fired the entire upper class of the Chilean clergy. So he was as much a Peronist as he was, a Catholic, which is saying a lot and not much, because there's not really a difference between being a Catholic in some ways. In your social view of your vision that the world, he's provided space for liberation theologians to come back. He invited Native Americans to the Vatican. This is another thing that sent the right wing off the rails. He had like an indigenous conclave in the Vatican walls. It would have been as if Las Casas sailed a boatload of Aztecs, Mapuches, and Mayans to debate issues of sovereignty and dominion and property in Seville in 1500s to Spain. He invited all of these Native Americans. They planted a tree. They did their Pachamama ceremony. They were in paint, and there's Pope Francis smiling. That was a big turning point in the hatred that the Catholic right cultivated against Francis.